Dr. Mikovits, you have decades of experience researching viruses for the U.S. government. And it turns out, during that career, you've had several troubling encounters with Dr. Anthony Fauci, President Trump's scientific advisor on the coronavirus and the current director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Can you tell our audience about your fateful conversation with Dr. Fauci in 1983 and why that conversation bears incredible relevance to his advice today on the pandemic?
Yes. In 1983, I was a 25-year-old laboratory technician working for Dr. Frank Rossetti, and I was part of the team that isolated HIV from saliva and blood, confirming Luc Montagnier's isolation of, he called it lymphadenopathy virus. At the time, we called AIDS gay-related immune dysfunction. GRID. And so I was part of the team that wrote that paper up. In the summer of that year, Dr. Rossetti was traveling, so I answered his phone. Dr. Rossetti's office, Tony Fauci was on the phone. Anthony Fauci was on the phone with Dr. Robert Gallo of the National Cancer Institute, who had formerly been Frank Rossetti's boss. So they called me to say that he understood we had a paper in press confirming the isolation of the lymphadenopathy virus, and he would like a copy of that. I said, I'm sorry, I can't give you a copy of it. It's unethical. It's confidential. It's in press. And I believe, and Dr. Gallo began screaming at me and saying I would be fired for insubordination. And I said, I'm really sorry. You can talk to Dr. Rossetti when he gets back in town. And that's the end of it. So Dr. Rossetti came back to town, and I actually took that paper. I should go back. I actually took the paper. I was quite fearful, the kind of vitriol that came out of their mouths, and they kind of scared me, as did the other technicians who heard this conversation when they told me who this man was, because I have no idea. I'm a kid. I'm 25 years old. And so I actually took the paper and secured it, locked, literally in a box under my bed, and asked a friend to give me a gun to protect myself. That's how afraid I was at that time. But Dr. Rossetti came back to town, and he was bullied into giving Dr. Fauci the paper. So a copy of the paper, Dr. Fauci had it removed from being in press, delayed its publication from the editors of a journal, and simply, delayed it to the point where Robert Gallo could copy it, claim he discovered the virus, and it wasn't in Luc Montagnier's sample. It wasn't the French LAV. It was a new one he then called HTLV3. This really changed the course of history as millions died as they delayed the serological testing, the antibody testing that could have prevented the spread of the virus across the country, and the knowledge of what it was and how it was hurting. So that was my first encounter with Dr. Fauci, and I did not have another encounter until 2010 and 11. When we had isolated in 2009 a family of mouse cancer-causing viruses from people with chronic fatigue syndrome, which during HIV/AIDS were women and children, and they were considered non-HIV/AIDS because they didn't have HIV, but they had immune dysfunction and deficiency, and it was marginalized. And Tony Fauci, as the head of the NIAID for more than 20 years, made certain that that disease wasn't associated with an infection. Another doctor named Elaine DeFreitas had isolated a retrovirus in the early 2000s, and her work was destroyed by Dr. Gallo and Dr. Fauci, who said, oh, we failed to replicate it. Her career was destroyed as well. So we published our paper in the journal Science, mainly because Dr. Rossetti was smart enough to avoid destroyed the cabal at the top of the HHS. He refused ever since that day to submit a paper through channels because the highest levels of the government have to check off that a paper is not against their whatever they're telling the public. So I did not even know that when we submitted our paper in 2009. So it came out in press. It was clear this was a new family of human retroviruses. Our work proceeded over the next 2 years and associated it not only with the prostate cancer and some of the leukemias and lymphomas in our original paper, but with autism and childhood diseases. And then, of course, we found that the blood supply was heavily contaminated, just like in the early days of AIDS. So when it was found out that, and one of our colleagues published that the most likely way mouse viruses got into humans was via biological therapies, and the biggest one was vaccines. So that was basically the story. In 2011, led by Tony Fauci and the NIAID, we had a $5 million grant that I had received before our paper published. Basically under the direction of Tony Fauci, because I wouldn't cover up the data, because once again, I refused to say the data weren't real. He initiated a bunch of fraudulent studies and had them published in journals in which his colleague was an editor, so that they could say that all these negative studies weigh in that you didn't discover it at all, when the data kept coming up right and true, and I refused to renounce it. I was fired, and then 6 weeks later arrested. The entire contents of my homes and offices was confiscated under the direction of Tony Fauci. I only learned much later when and all of my computers, all of my papers. I was removed from all of my grants as the principal investigator. My funding ruined. I still refuse to renounce the data that the blood supply was heavily contaminated, and likely vaccines were driving this epidemic of disease caused by this mouse HIV mouse retrovirus that we now learned was aerosolized. Now, cancer could cough through the air, and that was kind of the last straw. So I was held in jail. Fauci was directed by Francis Collins September of 2010 at a meeting at the NIH Clinical Center. He was directed to fund a large multi-center study to find out where the virus was, what the detail was, because the blood supply of London was also contaminated, and it appeared the virus had spread around the world almost certainly through contaminated cell lines and things like that, because all of our research is mouse cell lines. So, and people were getting sick, and this is what we grow our vaccines in. So Tony Fauci put I guess he told me I was forbidden to go to NIH as enlisted at NIH in the laboratories, that I was a fugitive from justice. And that and so I was arrested, my home ransacked November 18th, when this study was due to be published, November 18th, 2011. I was arrested without a warrant, without any due process. I was said to be a fugitive of justice. There was no charge. My home was ransacked and searched. I was held in jail for 5 days without bail. And with a bail hold on, that if I simply signed what was basically a confession that I'd done the whole XMRV thing for my greater glory, and I'm not even sure for whatever reason, and that if I signed this apology to the patient community in the world, I would be released, I don't even know what else. I think the end of the apology said I would spend the rest of my life doing honest research, and my reply was, I've spent my entire life doing honest research, and I just as soon die as you kill me, but I'm not signing that piece of paper. So they carried out their threats all along while I was held in jail. The editors of Science lost confidence in me. The paper was force retracted, and over the next a year and a half, the data for the multi-center study was done by me and Dr. Rossetti with me on the telephone, telling him which picture under the microscope is virology, doing everything we can to make sure that the study got done, because we knew our work was right and true. Dr. Varmus insisted that the infectious molecular clone be put in the study, and the importance of that is that's fraud. You can't put something in to contaminate, and it was agreed in the study not to do that. So when, against all odds, we found positive samples in December or whatever year, Tony Fauci basically stopped the study, said stop wasting NIH funds, and published a paper that was fraud, saying no XMRV was found, and that was the end of my career as I knew it. All the people were paid off, including Ian Lipkin, and everybody was given the grants, and the study went away.
Dr. Mikovits, I want to apologize to you on behalf of the American people. But what you just detailed is the wildest international medical scandal I think I've ever heard. And you heard alarm bells going off. I think there should be alarm bells going off in every house in this country right now. If even a percent of what you just said is true, and it all is true. I've read about this story, did not hear it, connect to it until you personally said it right now, detailed just the pain and crazy torture you went through for trying to do your job, to tell the truth. And there was a lot in there. The audience, I think, has to realize that this began right before Dr. Anthony Fauci became the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. That was in 1984. The position he holds to this day, and you noted that your funding was cut. In the case in 2011, it's really interesting because that same funding would have been pulling from the same pot of money that ended up going, according to reporting from Newsweek, Breitbart now, and other outlets on the subject of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That same money, the $3.7 million grant, which was then re-upped, according to the now reports from Newsweek, it's upwards of $7 million plus, went through EcoHealth Alliance to this Wuhan Institute of Virology. That money was spent on gain-of-function research for the coronavirus with bats, but your research, life-saving research, was cut off, and your life and career were tarnished. How do you feel about this now that Dr. Fauci is being heralded as a hero, the hero of the coronavirus pandemic and the point man for President Trump, especially with his now non-existent projections of 100,000 to 200,000 dead by mid-April?
Well, even worse, Ed. I mean, I feel absolutely horrible. That's why we memorialized all of this in 2 books over the last decade since this happened, and all of it is on tape, and every word of it is provable. And they've never said a word about it, because after they published that fraudulent study in October of 2012, Dr. Fauci awarded Ian Lipkin, the director of the study, who participated in this commission fraud, $34 million grant to start the Center for Discovery and Diagnostic. And parts of that money went to Dr. Barrick's lab at North Carolina to literally, and a paper was published about the epigenetics of the coronavirus and all of the disease signatures. This is not a coronavirus. It's the retroviruses, and they're covering it up. He's not a hero. zero. It's the retroviruses. Coronaviruses don't do what the clinical data say they're doing. And it's my belief that they're destroying the evidence, calling everything COVID-19, making sure they vaccinate everybody, and they will kill the people that they've injured with these vaccines for 4 decades. They will kill the HIV positive. They will kill the people, the children. They will kill the old people who are harboring these viruses and these horrible diseases, chronic diseases, 32 of which, cancer, autoimmune disease, all associated with the retrovirus, the animal retroviruses. This is the true zoonosis that is jumping into people. So out of pigs, out of cows, out of dogs, out of, just like the coronavirus came directly from Fort Detrick. Tony Fauci funded it when those studies were illegal in this country. Ian Lipkin funded it so how I feel is, unless we do something fast, these men have committed crimes against humanity for now, as you say, almost 40 years. Delayed testing, delayed drugs, exactly the tactics that they're using in COVID-19. And my response is simply that COVID-19 is a plague of corruption. It's not a coronavirus.